carriage. Then, suddenly unfastening his horse from the little tree to which his servant had tied it, he mounted and galloped off in the direction of Paris. In a quarter of an hour he was entering the house in the Rue du Helder. As he alighted, he thought he saw his father's pale face behind the curtain of the Count's bedroom. Albert turned away his head with a sigh and went to his own apartments. He cast one lingering look on all the luxuries which had rendered life so easy and so happy since his infancy. He looked at the pictures whose faces seemed to smile, and the landscapes which appeared painted in brighter colors. Then he took away his mother's portrait with its oaken frame, leaving the gilt frame from which he took it black and empty. Then he arranged all his beautiful Turkish arms, his fine English guns, his Japanese china, his cups mounted in silver, his artistic bronzes by Faucher and Barye, examined the cupboards and placed the key in each, threw into a drawer of his secretary, which he left open, all the pocket money he had about him, and with it the 1,000 fancy jewels from his vases and his jewel boxes. Then he made an exact inventory of everything, and placed it in the most conspicuous part of the table, after putting aside the books and papers which had collected there. At the beginning of this work, his servant, notwithstanding orders to the contrary, came to his room. "What do you want?" asked he, with a more sorrowful than angry tone. "Pardon me, sir," replied the valet. "You had forbidden me to disturb you, but the Count of Morcerf has called me." "Well," said Albert, "I did not like to go to him without first seeing you." "Why?" "Because the Count is doubtless aware that I accompanied you to the meeting this morning." "'Tis probable," said Albert. "And since he has sent for me, it is doubtless to question me on what happened there. What must I answer?" "The truth." "Then I shall say the duel did not take place?" "You will say I apologized to the Count of Monte Cristo. Go." The valet bowed and retired, and Albert returned to his inventory. As he was finishing his work, the sound of horses prancing in the yard and the wheels of a carriage shaking his window attracted his attention. He approached the window and saw his father get into it and drive away. The door was scarcely closed when Albert bent his steps to his mother's room, and no one being there to announce him, he advanced to her bedchamber, and, distressed by what he saw and guessed, stopped for one moment at the door. As if the same idea had animated these two beings, Mercedes was doing the same in her apartments that he had just done in his. Everything was in order. Laces, dresses, jewels, linen, money, all were arranged in the drawers, and the Countess was carefully collecting the keys. Albert saw all these preparations and understood them, and exclaiming, "My mother!" he threw his arms around her neck. The artist who could have depicted the expression of these two countenances would certainly have made of them a beautiful picture. All these proofs of an energetic resolution, which Albert did not fear on his own account, alarmed him for his mother. "What are you doing?" asked he. "What were you doing?" replied she. "Oh, my mother!" exclaimed Albert, so overcome he could scarcely speak. It is not the same with you and me. You cannot have made the same resolution I have, for I have come to warn you that I bid adieu to your house and to you." "I also," replied Mercedes, "am going, and I acknowledge I had depended on your accompanying me. Have I deceived myself?" "Mother," said Albert with firmness, "I cannot make you share the fate I have planned for myself. I must live henceforth without rank and fortune, and to begin this hard apprenticeship I must borrow from a friend the loaf I shall eat until I have earned one. So, my dear mother, I am going at once to ask Franz to lend me the small sum I shall require to supply my present wants. You, my poor child, suffer poverty and hunger? Oh, do not say so. It will break my resolutions." "But not mine, mother," replied Albert. "I am young and strong. I believe I am courageous, and since yesterday I have learned the power of will. Alas, my dear mother, some have suffered so much and yet live, and have raised a new fortune on the ruin of all the promises of happiness which heaven had made them, on the fragments of all the hope which God had given them. I have seen that, mother. I know that from the gulf in which their enemies have plunged them, they have risen with so much vigor and glory that in their turn they have ruled their former conquerors and have punished them. No, mother, from this moment I have done with the past and accept nothing from it, not even a name, because you can understand that your son cannot bear the name of a man who ought to blush for it before another." "Albert, my child," said Mercedes, "if I had a stronger heart, that is the counsel I would have given you. Your conscience has spoken when my voice became too weak. Listen to its dictates. You had friends, Albert. Break off their acquaintance, but do not despair. You have life before you, my dear Albert, for you are yet scarcely 22 years old, and as a pure heart like yours wants a spotless name, take my father's. It was Herrera. I am sure, my dear Albert, whatever may be your career, you will soon render that name illustrious. Then, my son, return to the world still more brilliant because of your former sorrows. And if I am wrong, still let me cherish these hopes, for I have no future to look forward to. For me, the grave opens when I pass the threshold of this house." "I will fulfill all your wishes, my dear mother," said the young man. "Yes, I share your hopes. The anger of heaven will not pursue us, since you are pure and I am innocent. But since our resolution is formed, let us act promptly. Monsieur de Morcerf went out about half an hour ago. The opportunity is favorable to avoid an explanation." "I am ready, my son," said Mercedes. Albert ran to fetch a carriage. He recollected there was a small furnished house to let in the Rue de Saint-Père, where his mother would find a humble but decent lodging, and thither he intended conducting the Countess. As the carriage stopped at the door, and Albert was alighting, a man approached and gave him a letter. Albert recognized the bearer. From the Count, said Bertuccio. Albert took the letter, opened and read it, then looked round for Bertuccio, but he was gone. He returned to Mercedes with tears in his eyes and heaving breast, and without uttering a word, he gave her the letter. Mercedes read, Albert, while showing you that I have discovered your plans, I hope also to convince you of my delicacy. You are free to leave the Count's house, and you take your mother to your home. But reflect, Albert, you owe her more than your poor noble heart can pay her. Keep the struggle for yourself, bear all the suffering, but spare her the trial of poverty which must accompany your first efforts, for she deserves not even the shadow of the misfortune which has this day fallen on her, and Providence is not willing that the innocent should suffer for the guilty. I know you are going to leave the Rue du Helder without taking anything with you. Do not seek to know how I discovered it. I know it. That is sufficient. Now, listen, Albert. 24 years ago I returned, proud and joyful, to my country. I had a betrothed, Albert, a lovely girl whom I adored, and I was bringing to my betrothed 150 louis, painfully amassed by ceaseless toil. This money was for her. I destined it for her, and knowing the treachery of the sea, I buried our treasure in the little garden of the house my father lived in at Marseilles, on the Allée de Meilhan. Your mother, Albert, knows that poor house well. A short time since I passed through Marseilles and went to see the old place, which revived so many painful recollections, and in the evening I took a spade and dug in the corner of the garden where I had concealed my treasure. The iron box was there. No one had touched it, under a beautiful fig tree my father had planted the day I was born, which overshadowed the spot. Well, Albert, this money, which was formerly designed to promote the comfort and tranquillity of the woman I adored, may now, through strange and painful circumstances, be devoted to the same purpose. Oh, feel for me, who could offer millions to that poor woman, but who return her only the piece of black bread forgotten under my poor roof since the day I was torn from her I loved. You are a generous man, Albert, but perhaps you may be blinded by pride or resentment. If you refuse me, if you ask another for what I have a right to offer you, I will say it is ungenerous of you to refuse the life of your mother at the hands of a man whose father was allowed by your father to die in all the horrors of poverty and despair. Albert stood pale and motionless to hear what his mother would decide after she had finished reading this letter. Mercedes turned her eyes with an ineffable look towards heaven. I accept it, said she. He has a right to pay the dowry, which I shall take with me to some convent. Putting the letter in her bosom, she took her son's arm, and with a firmer step than even she herself expected, she went downstairs. End of chapter 91. Read by Dennis Sayers for LibriVox in Modesto, California, Fall 2006.
Chapter 92 of The Count of Monte Cristo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 92. The Suicide. Meanwhile, Monte Cristo had also returned to town with Emmanuel and Maximilian. Their return was cheerful. Emmanuel did not conceal his joy at the peaceful termination of the affair, and was loud in his expressions of delight. Morel, in a corner of the carriage, allowed his brother-in-law's gaiety to expend itself in words, while he felt equal inward joy, which, however, betrayed itself only in his countenance. At the Barrière du Trône they met Bertuccio, who was waiting there, motionless as a sentinel at his post. Monte Cristo put his head out of the window, exchanged a few words with him in a low tone, and the steward disappeared. "Count," said Emmanuel, when they were at the end of the Place Royale, "put me down at my door, that my wife may not have a single moment of needless anxiety on my account or yours. If it were not ridiculous to make a display of our triumph, I would invite the Count to our house. Besides that, he doubtless has some trembling heart to comfort, so we will take leave of our friend, and let him hasten home." "Stop a moment," said Monte Cristo. "Do not let me lose both my companions. Return, Emmanuel, to your charming wife, and present my best compliments to her. And do you, Morel, accompany me to the Champs-Élysées." "Willingly," said Maximilian, "particularly as I have business in that quarter." "Shall we wait breakfast for you?" asked Emmanuel. "No," replied the young man. The door was closed, and the carriage proceeded. "See what good fortune I brought you," said Morel, when he was alone with the Count. "Have you not thought so?" "Yes," said Monte Cristo. "For that reason I wish to keep you near me." "It is miraculous," continued Morel, answering his own thoughts. "What?" said Monte Cristo. "What has just happened?" "Yes," said the Count, "you are right. It is miraculous." "For Albert is brave," resumed Morel. "Very brave," said Monte Cristo. "I have seen him sleep with a sword suspended over his head." "And I know he has fought 2 duels," said Morel. "How can you reconcile that with his conduct this morning?" "All owing to your influence," replied Monte Cristo, smiling. "It is well for Albert he is not in the army," said Morel. "Why?" "An apology on the ground," said the young captain, shaking his head. "Come," said the Count mildly, "do not entertain the prejudices of ordinary men, Morel. Acknowledge that if Albert is brave, he cannot be a coward. He must then have had some reason for acting as he did this morning, and confess that his conduct is more heroic than otherwise." "Doubtless, doubtless," said Morel. "But I shall say, like the Spaniard, he has not been so brave today as he was yesterday." "You will breakfast with me, will you not, Morel?" said the Count, to turn the conversation. "No, I must leave you at 10 o'clock." "Your engagement was for breakfast, then?" said the Count. Morel smiled and shook his head. "Still, you must breakfast somewhere." "But if I am not hungry?" said the young man. "Oh," said the Count, "I only know 2 things which destroy the appetite: grief, and as I am happy to see you very cheerful, it is not that, and love. Now, after what you told me this morning of your heart, I may believe—" "Well, Count," replied Morel gaily, "I will not dispute it." "But you will not make me your confidant, Maximilian?" said the Count, in a tone which showed how gladly he would have been admitted to the secret. "I showed you this morning that I had a heart, did I not, Count?" Monte Cristo only answered by extending his hand to the young man. "Well," continued the latter, "since that heart is no longer with you in the Bois de Vincennes, it is elsewhere, and I must go and find it." "Go," said the Count deliberately. "Go, dear friend, but promise me, if you meet with any obstacle, to remember that I have some power in this world, that I am happy to use that power in the behalf of those I love, and that I love you, Morel." "I will remember it," said the young man, "as selfish children recollect their parents when they want their aid. When I need your assistance, and the moment arrives, I will come to you, Count." "Well, I rely upon your promise. Goodbye, then." "Goodbye, till we meet again." They had arrived in the Champs-Élysées. Monte Cristo opened the carriage door. Morel sprang out on the pavement. Bertuccio was waiting on the steps. Morel disappeared down the Avenue de Marigny, and Monte Cristo hastened to join Bertuccio. "Well?" asked he. "She is going to leave her house," said the steward. "And her son?" "Florentin, his valet, thinks he is going to do the same." "Come this way." Monte Cristo took Bertuccio into his study, wrote the letter we have seen, and gave it to the steward. "Go," said he quickly, "but first let Heidi be informed that I have returned." "Here I am," said the young girl, who at the sound of the carriage had run downstairs, and whose face was radiant with joy at seeing the Count return safely. Bertuccio left. Every transport of a daughter finding a father, all the delight of a mistress seeing an adored lover, were felt by Heidi during the first moments of this meeting, which she had so eagerly expected. Doubtless, although less evident, Monte Cristo's joy was not less intense. Joy to hearts which have suffered long is like the dew on the ground after a long drought. Both the heart and the ground absorb that beneficent moisture falling on them, and nothing is outwardly apparent. Monte Cristo was beginning to think, what he had not for a long time dared to believe, that there were two Mercedes in the world, and he might yet be happy. His eye, elate with happiness, was reading eagerly the tearful gaze of Heidi, when suddenly the door opened. The Count knit his brow. "Monsieur de Morcerf," said Baptistin, as if that name sufficed for his excuse. In fact, the Count's face brightened. "Which?" asked he, "the Viscount or the Count?" "The Count." "Oh!" exclaimed Heidi, "is it not yet over?" "I know not if it is finished, my beloved child," said Monte Cristo, taking the young girl's hands, "but I do know you have nothing more to fear." "But it is the wretched—" "That man cannot injure me, Heidi," said Monte Cristo. "It was his son alone that there was cause to fear." "And what I have suffered," said the young girl, "you shall never know, my lord." Monte Cristo smiled. "By my father's tomb," said he, extending his hand over the head of the young girl, "I swear to you, Heidi, that if any misfortune happens, it will not be to me." "I believe you, my lord, as implicitly as if God had spoken to me," said the young girl, presenting her forehead to him. Monte Cristo pressed on that pure, beautiful forehead a kiss which made two hearts throb at once, the one violently, the other heavily. "Oh," murmured the Count, "shall I then be permitted to love again?" "Ask Monsieur de Morcerf into the drawing-room," said he to Baptistin, while he led the beautiful Greek girl to a private staircase. We must explain this visit, which, although expected by Monte Cristo, is unexpected to our readers. While Mercédès, as we have said, was making a similar inventory of her property to Albert's, while she was arranging her jewels, shutting her drawers, collecting her keys, to leave everything in perfect order, she did not perceive a pale and sinister face at a glass door which threw light into the passage, from which everything could be both seen and heard. He who was thus looking, without being heard or seen, probably heard and saw all that passed in Madame de Morcerf's apartments. From that glass door the pale-faced man went to the Count's bedroom, and raised with a constricted hand the curtain of a window overlooking the courtyard. He remained there 10 minutes, motionless and dumb, listening to the beating of his own heart. For him those 10 minutes were very long. It was then Albert, returning from his meeting with the Count, perceived his father watching for his arrival behind a curtain, and turned aside. The Count's eye expanded. He knew Albert had insulted the Count dreadfully, and that in every country in the world such an insult would lead to a deadly duel. Albert returned safely, then the Count was revenged. An indescribable ray of joy illumined that wretched countenance, like the last ray of the sun before it disappears behind the clouds which bear the aspect, not of a downy couch, but of a tomb. But as we have said, he waited in vain for his son to come to his apartment with the account of his triumph. He easily understood why his son did not come to see him before he went to avenge his father's honor. But when that was done, why did not his son come and throw himself into his arms? It was then, when the Count could not see Albert, that he sent for his servant, who he knew was authorized not to conceal anything from him. 10 minutes afterwards, General Morcerf was seen on the steps in a black coat, with a military collar, black pantaloons, and black gloves. He had apparently given previous orders, for as he reached the bottom step his carriage came from the coach-house ready for him. The valet threw into the carriage his military cloak, in which 2 swords were wrapped, and, shutting the door, he took his seat by the side of the coachman. The coachman stooped down for his orders. "To the Champs-Élysées," said the general. "The Count of Monte Cristo's. Hurry!" The horses bounded beneath the whip, and in 5 minutes they stopped before the Count's door. Monsieur de Morcerf opened the door himself, and as the carriage rolled away, he passed up the walk, rang, and entered the open door with his servant. A moment afterwards, Baptistin announced the Count of Morcerf to Monte Cristo, and the latter, leading Heidi aside, ordered that Morcerf be asked into the drawing-room. The general was pacing the room the third time when, in turning, he perceived Monte Cristo at the door. "Ah, it is Monsieur de Morcerf," said Monte Cristo quietly. "I thought I had not heard aright." "Yes, it is I," said the count, whom a frightful contraction of the lips prevented from articulating freely. "May I know the cause which procures me the pleasure of seeing Monsieur de Morcerf so early?" "Had you not a meeting with my son this morning?" asked the general. "I had," replied the count. "And I know my son had good reasons to wish to fight with you, and to endeavor to kill you." "Yes, sir, he had very good ones; but you see that, in spite of them, he has not killed me, and did not even fight." "Yet he considered you the cause of his father's dishonor, the cause of the fearful ruin which has fallen on my house." "It is true, sir," said Monte Cristo, with his dreadful calmness. "A secondary cause, but not the principal." "Doubtless you made then some apology or explanation?" "I explained nothing, and it is he who apologized to me." "But to what do you attribute this conduct?" "To the conviction, probably, that there was one more guilty than I." "And who was that?" "His father." "That may be," said the count, turning pale, "but you know the guilty do not like to find themselves convicted." "I know it, and I expected this result." "You expected my son would be a coward?" cried the count. "Monsieur Albert de Morcerf is no coward," said Monte Cristo. "A man who holds a sword in his hand, and sees a mortal enemy within reach of that sword, and does not fight, is a coward. Why is he not here, that I may tell him so?" "Sir," replied Monte Cristo coldly, "I did not expect that you had come here to relate to me your little family affairs. Go and tell Monsieur Albert that, and he may know what to answer you." "No, no, no," said the general, smiling faintly. "I did not come for that purpose. You are right. I came to tell you that I also look upon you as my enemy. I came to tell you that I hate you instinctively, that it seems as if I had always known you, and always hated you; and, in short, since the young people of the present day will not fight, it remains for us to do so. Do you think so, sir?" "Certainly; and when I told you I had foreseen the result, it is the honor of your visit I alluded to." "So much the better. Are you prepared?" "Yes, sir." "You know that we shall fight till one of us is dead," said the general, whose teeth were clinched with rage. "Until one of us dies," repeated Monte Cristo, moving his head slightly up and down. "Let us start, then. We need no witnesses." "Very true," said Monte Cristo. "It is unnecessary; we know each other so well." "On the contrary," said the count, "we know so little of each other." "Indeed?" said Monte Cristo, with the same indomitable coolness. "Let us see. Are you not the soldier Fernand, who deserted on the eve of the battle of Waterloo? Are you not the Lieutenant Fernand who served as guide and spy to the French army in Spain? Are you not the Captain Fernand who betrayed, sold, and murdered his benefactor Ali? And have not all these Fernands, united, made Lieutenant General the Count of Morcerf peer of France?" "Oh," cried the general, as it branded with a hot iron, "wretch! To reproach me with my shame when about perhaps to kill me! No, I did not say I was a stranger to you. I know well, demon, that you have penetrated into the darkness of the past, and that you have read, by the light of what torch I know not, every page of my life. But perhaps I may be more honorable in my shame than you under your pompous coverings. No, no, I am aware you know me, but I know you only as an adventurer sewn up in gold and jewelry. You call yourself in Paris the Count of Monte Cristo, in Italy Sinbad the Sailor, in Malta I forget what. But it is your real name I want to know, in the midst of your 100 names, that I may pronounce it when we meet to fight, at the moment when I plunge my sword through your heart." The Count of Monte Cristo turned dreadfully pale. His eye seemed to burn with a devouring fire. He leaped towards a dressing room near his bedroom, and in less than a moment, tearing off his cravat, his coat, and waistcoat, he put on a sailor's jacket and hat, from beneath which he rolled his long black hair. He returned thus, formidable and implacable, advancing with his arms crossed on his breast, towards the general, who could not understand why he had disappeared, but who, on seeing him again, and feeling his teeth chatter and his legs sink under him, drew back, and only stopped when he found a table to support his clenched hand. "Fernand," cried he, "of my 100 names, I need only tell you one to overwhelm you. But you guess it now, do you not? Or, rather, you remember it? For, notwithstanding all my sorrows and my tortures, I show you today a face which the happiness of revenge makes young again, a face you must often have seen in your dreams since your marriage with Mercédès, my betrothed." The general, with his head thrown back, hands extended, gaze fixed, looked silently at this dreadful apparition. Then, seeking the wall to support him, he glided along close to it until he reached the door, through which he went out backwards, uttering this single, mournful, lamentable, distressing cry, Edmond Dantès. Then, with sighs which were unlike any human sound, he dragged himself to the door, reeled across the courtyard, and falling into the arms of his valet, he said in a voice scarcely intelligible, "Home, home." The fresh air and the shame he felt at having exposed himself before his servants partly recalled his senses, but the ride was short, and as he drew near his house all his wretchedness revived. He stopped at a short distance from the house and alighted. The door was wide open. A hackney coach was standing in the middle of the yard. A strange sight before so noble a mansion. The count looked at it with terror, but without daring to inquire its meaning, he rushed towards his apartment. Two persons were coming down the stairs. He had only time to creep into an alcove to avoid them. It was Mercedes leaning on her son's arm and leaving the house. They passed close by the unhappy being, who, concealed behind the damask curtain, almost felt Mercedes' dress brush past him, and his son's warm breath pronouncing these words, "Courage, mother! Come, this is no longer our home." The words died away. The steps were lost in the distance. The general drew himself up, clinging to the curtain. He uttered the most dreadful sob which ever escaped from the bosom of a father abandoned at the same time by his wife and son. He soon heard the clatter of the iron step of the hackney coach, then the coachman's voice, and then the rolling of the heavy vehicle shook the windows. He darted to his bedroom to see once more all he had loved in the world. But the hackney coach drove on, and the head of neither Mercedes nor her son appeared at the window to take a last look at the house, or the deserted father and husband. And at the very moment when the wheels of that coach crossed the gateway, a report was heard, and a thick smoke escaped through one of the panes of the window, which was broken by the explosion. End of chapter 92. Chapter 93 of The Count of Monte Cristo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 93. Valentine. We may easily conceive where Morel's appointment was. On leaving Monte Cristo, he walked slowly towards Villefort. We say slowly, for Morel had more than half an hour to spare to go 500 steps, but he had hastened to take leave of Monte Cristo because he wished to be alone with his thoughts. He knew his time well, the hour when Valentine was giving Noirtier his breakfast, and was sure not to be disturbed in the performance of this pious duty. Noirtier and Valentine had given him leave to go twice a week, and he was now availing himself of that permission. He had arrived. Valentine was expecting him. Uneasy and almost crazed, she seized his hand and led him to her grandfather. This uneasiness, amounting almost to frenzy, arose from the report Morcerf's adventure had made in the world, for the affair at the opera was generally known. No one at Villefort's doubted that a duel would ensue from it. Valentine, with her woman's instinct, guessed that Morel would be Monte Cristo's second, and from the young man's well-known courage and his great affection for the count, she feared that he would not content himself with the passive part assigned to him. We may easily understand how eagerly the particulars were asked for, given, and received, and Morel could read an indescribable joy in the eyes of his beloved, when she knew that the termination of this affair was as happy as it was unexpected. "Now," said Valentine, motioning to Morel to sit down near her grandfather, while she took her seat on his footstool, "now let us talk about our own affairs. You know, Maximilian, Grandpapa once thought of leaving this house, and taking an apartment away from Monsieur de Villefort's." "Yes," said Maximilian, "I recollect the project, of which I highly approved." "Well," said Valentine, "you may approve again, for Grandpapa is again thinking of it." "Bravo!" said Maximilian. "And do you know," said Valentine, "what reason Grandpapa gives for leaving this house?" Noirtier looked at Valentine to impose silence, but she did not notice him. Her looks, her eyes, her smile, were all for Morel. "Oh, whatever may be Monsieur Noirtier's reason," answered Morel, "I can readily believe it to be a good one." "An excellent one," said Valentine. He pretends the air of the Faubourg Saint-Honore is not good for me." "Indeed?" said Morel. "In that Monsieur Noirtier may be right. You have not seemed to be well for the last fortnight." "Not very," said Valentine, "and grandpapa has become my physician, and I have the greatest confidence in him, because he knows everything." "Do you then really suffer?" asked Morel quickly. "Oh, it must not be called suffering. I feel a general uneasiness, that is all. I have lost my appetite, and my stomach feels as if it were struggling to get accustomed to something." Noirtier did not lose a word of what Valentine said. "And what treatment do you adopt for this singular complaint?" "A very simple one," said Valentine. "I swallow every morning a spoonful of the mixture prepared for my grandfather. When I say 1 spoonful, I began by 1. Now I take 4. Grandpapa says it is a panacea." Valentine smiled, but it was evident that she suffered. Maximilian, in his devotedness, gazed silently at her. She was very beautiful, but her usual pallor had increased. Her eyes were more brilliant than ever, and her hands, which were generally white like mother of pearl, now more resembled wax, to which time was adding a yellowish hue. From Valentine the young man looked towards Noirtier. The latter watched with strange and deep interest the young girl, absorbed by her affection, and he also, like Morel, followed those traces of inward suffering which was so little perceptible to a common observer that they escaped the notice of everyone but the grandfather and the lover. "But," said Morel, "I thought this mixture, of which you now take 4 spoonfuls, was prepared for Monsieur Noirtier." "I know it is very bitter," said Valentine, "so bitter that all I drink afterwards appears to have the same taste." Noirtier looked inquiringly at his granddaughter. "Yes, grandpapa," said Valentine, "it is so. Just now, before I came down to you, I drank a glass of sugared water. I left half because it seemed so bitter." Noirtier turned pale, and made a sign that he wished to speak. Valentine rose to fetch the dictionary. Noirtier watched her with evident anguish. In fact, the blood was rushing to the young girl's head already. Her cheeks were becoming red. "Oh!" she cried, without losing any of her cheerfulness, "this is singular! I can't see! Did the sun shine in my eyes?" And she leaned against the window. "The sun is not shining," said Morel, more alarmed by Noirtier's expression than by Valentine's indisposition. He ran towards her. The young girl smiled. "Cheer up," she said to Noirtier. "Do not be alarmed, Maximilian. It is nothing, and has already passed away. But listen, do I not hear a carriage in the courtyard?" She opened Noirtier's door, ran to a window in the passage, and returned hastily. "Yes," said she, "it is Madame Danglars and her daughter, who have come to call on us. Good-bye. I must run away, for they would send here for me, or, rather, farewell till I see you again. Stay with grandpapa, Maximilian. I promise you not to persuade them to stay." Morel watched her as she left the room. He heard her ascend the little staircase which led both to Madame de Villefort's apartments and to hers. As soon as she was gone, Noirtier made a sign to Morel to take the dictionary. Morel obeyed. Guided by Valentine, he had learned how to understand the old man quickly. Accustomed, however, as he was to the work, he had to repeat most of the letters of the alphabet and to find every word in the dictionary, so that it was 10 minutes before the thought of the old man was translated by these words: "Fetch the glass of water and the decanter from Valentine's room." Morel rang immediately for the servant, who had taken Barrois's situation, and in Noirtier's name gave that order. The servant soon returned. The decanter and the glass were completely empty. Noirtier made a sign that he wished to speak. "Why are the glass and decanter empty?" asked he. "Valentine said she only drank half the glassful." The translation of this new question occupied another 5 minutes. "I do not know," said the servant, "but the housemaid is in Mademoiselle Valentine's room. Perhaps she has emptied them." "Ask her," said Morel, translating Noirtier's thought, this time by his look. The servant went out, but returned almost immediately. "Mademoiselle Valentine passed through the room to go to Madame de Villefort's," said he, "and in passing, as she was thirsty, she drank what remained in the glass. As for the decanter, Master Edward had emptied that to make a pond for his ducks." Noirtier raised his eyes to heaven, as a gambler does who stakes his all on one stroke. From that moment the old man's eyes were fixed on the door, and did not quit it. It was indeed Madame Danglars and her daughter whom Valentine had seen. They had been ushered into Madame de Villefort's room, who had said she would receive them there. That is why Valentine passed through her room, which was on a level with Valentine's, and only separated from it by Edward's. The two ladies entered the drawing-room with that sort of official stiffness which preludes a formal communication. Among worldly people manner is contagious. Madame de Villefort received them with equal solemnity. Valentine entered at this moment, and the formalities were resumed. "My dear friend," said the Baroness, while the two young people were shaking hands, "I and Eugenie are come to be the first to announce to you the approaching marriage of my daughter with Prince Cavalcanti." Danglars kept up the title of Prince. The popular banker found that it answered better than Count. "Allow me to present you my sincere congratulations," replied Madame de Villefort. "Prince Cavalcanti appears to be a young man of rare qualities." "Listen," said the Baroness, smiling. "Speaking to you as a friend, I can say that the prince does not yet appear all he will be. He has about him a little of that foreign manner by which French persons recognize, at first sight, the Italian or German nobleman. Besides, he gives evidence of great kindness of disposition, much keenness of wit, and as to suitability, Monsieur Danglars assures me that his fortune is majestic. That is his word." "And then," said Eugenie, while turning over the leaves of Madame de Villefort's album, "add that you have taken a great fancy to the young man." "And," said Madame de Villefort, "I need not ask you if you share that fancy." "I?" replied Eugenie, with her usual candor. "Oh, not the least in the world, madame. My wish was not to confine myself to domestic cares or the caprices of any man, but to be an artist, and consequently free in heart, in person, and in thought." Eugenie pronounced these words with so firm a tone that the color mounted to Valentine's cheeks. The timid girl could not understand that vigorous nature which appeared to have none of the timidities of women. "At any rate," said she, "since I am to be married whether I will or not, I ought to be thankful to Providence for having released me from my engagement with Monsieur Albert de Morcerf, or I should this day have been the wife of a dishonored man." "It is true," said the Baroness, with that strange simplicity sometimes met with among fashionable ladies, and of which plebeian intercourse can never entirely deprive them. "It is very true that had not the Morcerfs hesitated, my daughter would have married Monsieur Albert. The general depended much on it; he even came to force Monsieur Danglars. We have had a narrow escape." "But," said Valentine timidly, "does all the father's shame revert upon the son? Monsieur Albert seems to me quite innocent of the treason charged against the general." "Excuse me," said the implacable young girl, "Monsieur Albert claims and well deserves his share. It appears that after having challenged Monsieur de Monte Cristo at the Opera yesterday, he apologized on the ground today." "Impossible," said Madame de Villefort. "Ah, my dear friend," said Madame Danglars, with the same simplicity we before noticed, "it is a fact. I heard it from Monsieur Debray, who was present at the explanation." Valentine also knew the truth, but she did not answer. A single word had reminded her that Morrel was expecting her in Monsieur Noirtier's room. Deeply engaged with a sort of inward contemplation, Valentine had ceased for a moment to join in the conversation. She would indeed have found it impossible to repeat what had been said the last few minutes, when suddenly Madame Danglars' hand, pressed on her arm, aroused her from her lethargy. "What is it?" said she, starting at Madame Danglars' touch, as she would have done from an electric shock. "It is, my dear Valentine," said the Baroness, "that you are doubtless suffering." "I?" said the young girl, passing her hand across her burning forehead. "Yes, look at yourself in that glass. You have turned pale and then red successively 3 or 4 times in 1 minute." "Indeed," cried Eugenie, "you are very pale." "Oh, do not be alarmed. I have been so for many days." Artless as she was, the young girl knew that this was an opportunity to leave, and besides, Madame de Villefort came to her assistance. "Retire, Valentine," said she. "You are really suffering, and these ladies will excuse you. Drink a glass of pure water; it will restore you." Valentine kissed Eugenie, bowed to Madame Danglars, who had already risen to take her leave, and went out. "That poor child," said Madame de Villefort, when Valentine was gone. "She makes me very uneasy, and I should not be astonished if she had some serious illness." Meanwhile, Valentine, in a sort of excitement which she could not quite understand, had crossed Edward's room without noticing some trick of the child, and through her own had reached the little staircase. She was within 3 steps of the bottom, she already heard Morrel's voice, when suddenly a cloud passed over her eyes, her stiffened foot missed the step, her hands had no power to hold the baluster, and falling against the wall, she lost her balance wholly and toppled to the floor. Morrel bounded to the door, opened it, and found Valentine stretched out at the bottom of the stairs. Quick as a flash, he raised her in his arms and placed her in a chair. Valentine opened her eyes. "Oh, what a clumsy thing I am!" said she with feverish volubility. I don't know my way. I forgot there were 3 more steps before the landing." "You have hurt yourself, perhaps," said Morel. "What can I do for you, Valentine?" Valentine looked around her. She saw the deepest terror depicted in Noirtier's eyes. "Don't worry, dear grandpapa," said she, endeavoring to smile. "It is nothing. It is nothing. I was giddy, that is all." "Another attack of giddiness," said Morel, clasping his hands. "Oh, attend to it, Valentine, I entreat you." "But no," said Valentine. "No, I tell you it is all past, and it was nothing. Now let me tell you some news. Eugenie is to be married in a week, and in 3 days there is to be a grand feast, a betrothal festival. We are all invited, my father, Madame de Villefort, and I. At least, I understand it so. When will it be our turn to think of these things? Oh, Valentine, you who have so much influence over your grandpapa, try to make him answer soon." "And do you," said Valentine, "depend on me to stimulate the tardiness and arouse the memory of grandpapa?" "Yes," cried Morel, "make haste. So long as you are not mine, Valentine, I shall always think I may lose you." "Oh," replied Valentine with a convulsive moment, "oh, indeed, Maximilian, you are too timid for an officer, for a soldier who, they say, never knows fear. Ha, ha, ha!" She burst into a forced and melancholy laugh. Her arms stiffened and twisted, her head fell back on her chair, and she remained motionless. The cry of terror which was stopped on Noirtier's lips seemed to start from his eyes. Morel understood it. He knew he must call assistance. The young man rang the bell violently. The housemaid who had been in Mademoiselle Valentine's room, and the servant who had replaced Barrois, ran in at the same moment. Valentine was so pale, so cold, so inanimate, that without listening to what was said to them they were seized with the fear which pervaded that house, and they flew into the passage crying for help. Madame Danglars and Eugenie were going out at that moment. They heard the cause of the disturbance. "I told you so!" exclaimed Madame de Villefort. "Poor child!" End of chapter 93.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Ana Sofia Simão de Portugal. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 94. Maximilian's Avowal. At the same moment, Monsieur de Villefort's voice.
Chapter 94 of The Count of Monte Cristo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 94. Maximilian's Avowal. At the same moment, Monsieur de Villefort's voice was heard calling from his study. "What is the matter?" Morel looked at Noirtier, who had recovered his self-command, and with a glance indicated the closet where once before, under somewhat similar circumstances, he had taken refuge. He had only time to get his hat and throw himself breathless into the closet when the procureur's footstep was heard in the passage. Villefort sprang into the room, ran to Valentine, and took her in his arms. "A physician! A physician! Monsieur d'Avrigny!" cried Villefort. "Or rather, I will go for him myself." He flew from the apartment, and Morel at the same moment darted out at the other door. He had been struck to the heart by a frightful recollection. The conversation he had heard between the doctor and Villefort the night of Madame de Saint-Méran's death recurred to him. These symptoms, to a less alarming extent, were the same which had preceded the death of Barrois. At the same time, Monte Cristo's voice seemed to resound in his ear with the words he had heard only 2 hours before. "Whatever you want, Morel, come to me. I have great power." More rapidly than thought, he darted down the Rue Matignon, and thence to the Avenue des Champs-Élysées. Meanwhile, Monsieur de Villefort arrived in a hired cabriolet at Monsieur d'Avrigny's door. He rang so violently that the porter was alarmed. Villefort ran upstairs without saying a word. The porter knew him and let him pass, only calling to him, "In his study, Monsieur Procureur, in his study." Villefort pushed, or rather forced, the door open. "Ah," said the doctor, "is it you?" "Yes," said Villefort, closing the door after him, "it is I, who come in my turn to ask you if we are quite alone. Doctor, my house is accursed. What? Said the latter with apparent coolness, but with deep emotion. Have you another invalid? Yes, doctor, cried Villefort, clutching his hair. Yes. D'Avrigny's look implied, I told you it would be so. Then slowly he uttered these words. Who is now dying in your house? What new victim is going to accuse you of weakness before God? A mournful sob burst from Villefort's heart. He approached the doctor, and seizing his arm, Valentine, he said, it is Valentine's turn. Your daughter? Cried d'Avrigny, with grief and surprise. You see you were deceived, murmured the magistrate. Come and see her, and on her bed of agony entreat her pardon for having suspected her. Each time you have applied to me, said the doctor, it has been too late. Still, I will go. But let us make haste, sir. With the enemies you have to do with, there is no time to be lost. Oh, this time, doctor, you shall not have to reproach me with weakness. This time I will know the assassin and will pursue him. Let us try first to save the victim before we think of revenging her, said d'Avrigny. Come. The same cabriolet which had brought Villefort took them back at full speed, and at this moment Morrel rapped at Monte Cristo's door. The Count was in his study and was reading, with an angry look, something which Bertuccio had brought in haste. Hearing the name of Morrel, who had left him only 2 hours before, the Count raised his head, arose, and sprang to meet him. "What is the matter, Maximilian?" asked he. "You're pale, and the perspiration rolls from your forehead." Morrel fell into a chair. "Yes," said he, "I came quickly. I wanted to speak to you." "Are all your family well?" asked the Count, with an affectionate benevolence whose sincerity no one could for a moment doubt. "Thank you, Count, thank you," said the young man, evidently embarrassed how to begin the conversation. "Yes, everyone in my family is well." "So much the better. Yet you have something to tell me," replied the Count with increased anxiety. "Yes," said Morrel, "it is true. I have but now left a house where death has just entered to run to you." "Are you then come from Monsieur de Morcerf's?" asked Monte Cristo. "No," said Morrel. "Is someone dead in his house?" "The general has just blown his brains out," replied Monte Cristo with great coolness. "Oh, what a dreadful event!" cried Maximilian. "Not for the Countess, or for Albert," said Monte Cristo. "A dead father or husband is better than a dishonoured one. Blood washes out shame." "Poor Countess," said Maximilian. "I pity her very much. She is so noble a woman." "Pity Albert also, Maximilian, for believe me, he is the worthy son of the Countess. But let us return to yourself. You have hastened to me. Can I have the happiness of being useful to you?" "Yes, I need your help. That is, I thought like a madman that you could lend me your assistance in a case where God alone can succour me." "Tell me what it is," replied Monte Cristo. "Oh," said Morrel, "I know not, indeed, if I may reveal this secret to mortal ears, but fatality impels me, necessity constrains me, Count." Morrel hesitated. "Do you think I love you?" said Monte Cristo, taking the young man's hand affectionately in his. "Oh, you encourage me, and something tells me there," placing his hand on his heart, "that I ought to have no secret from you." "You are right, Morrel. God is speaking to your heart, and your heart speaks to you. Tell me what it says." "Count, will you allow me to send Baptistin to inquire after someone you know?" "I am at your service, and still more my servant's." "Oh, I cannot live if she is not better." "Shall I ring for Baptistin?" "No, I will go and speak to him myself." Morrel went out, called Baptistin, and whispered a few words to him. The valet ran directly. "Well, have you sent?" asked Monte Cristo, seeing Morrel return. Yes, and now I shall be more calm. You know I am waiting, said Monte Cristo, smiling. Yes, and I will tell you. One evening I was in a garden. A clump of trees concealed me. No one suspected I was there. 2 persons passed near me. Allow me to conceal their names for the present. They were speaking in an undertone, and yet I was so interested in what they said that I did not lose a single word. This is a gloomy introduction, if I may judge from your pallor and shuddering, Morrel. Oh, yes, very gloomy, my friend. Someone had just died in the house to which that garden belonged. One of the persons whose conversation I overheard was the master of the house, the other the physician. The former was confiding to the latter his grief and fear, for it was the 2nd time within a month that death had suddenly and unexpectedly entered that house, which was apparently destined to destruction by some exterminating angel, as an object of God's anger. Ah, indeed, said Monte Cristo, looking earnestly at the young man, and by an imperceptible movement turning his chair, so that he remained in the shade, while the light fell full on Maximilian's face. Yes, continued Morrel, death had entered that house twice within 1 month. And what did the doctor answer? Asked Monte Cristo. He replied that the death was not a natural one, and must be attributed to what? To poison. Indeed, said Monte Cristo, with a slight cough, which in moments of extreme emotion helped him to disguise a blush or his pallor, or the intense interest with which he listened. Indeed, Maximilian, did you hear that? Yes, my dear Count, I heard it, and the doctor added that if another death occurred in a similar way, he must appeal to justice. Monte Cristo listened, or appeared to do so, with the greatest calmness. Well, said Maximilian, death came a 3rd time, and neither the master of the house nor the doctor said a word. Death is now perhaps striking a 4th blow. Count, what am I bound to do, being in possession of this secret? My dear friend, said Monte Cristo, you appear to be relating an adventure which we all know by heart. I know the house where you heard it, or one very similar to it, a house with a garden, a master, a physician, and where there have been 3 unexpected and sudden deaths. Well, I have not intercepted your confidence, and yet I know all that as well as you, and I have no conscientious scruples. No, it does not concern me. You say an exterminating angel appears to have devoted that house to God's anger. Well, who says your supposition is not reality? Do not notice things which those whose interest it is to see them pass over. If it is God's justice, instead of his anger, which is walking through that house, Maximilian, turn away your face, and let his justice accomplish its purpose. Morrel shuddered. There was something mournful, solemn, and terrible in the Count's manner. Besides, continued he, in so changed a tone that no one would have supposed it was the same person speaking. Besides, who says that it will begin again? It has returned, Count, exclaimed Morrel. That is why I hasten to you. Well, what do you wish me to do? Do you wish me, for instance, to give information to the procureur? Monte Cristo uttered the last words with so much meaning that Morrel, starting up, cried out, "You know of whom I speak, Count, do you not?" "Perfectly well, my good friend, and I will prove it to you by putting the dots to the I, or rather by naming the persons. You were walking one evening in Monsieur de Villefort's garden. From what you relate, I suppose it to have been the evening of Madame de Saint-Méran's death. You heard Monsieur de Villefort talking to Monsieur d'Avrigny about the death of Monsieur de Saint-Méran, and that, no less surprising, of the Countess. Monsieur d'Avrigny said he believed they both proceeded from poison. And you, honest man, have ever since been asking your heart and sounding your conscience to know if you ought to expose or conceal this secret. Why do you torment them? Conscience, what hast thou done to me? As Sterne said, my dear fellow, let them sleep on if they are asleep. Let them grow pale in their drowsiness if they are disposed to do so, and pray do you remain in peace, who have no remorse to disturb you. Deep grief was depicted on Morel's features. He seized Monte Cristo's hand. But it is beginning again, I say. Well, said the Count, astonished at his perseverance, which he could not understand, and looking still more earnestly at Maximilian. Let it begin again. It is like the house of the Atreidae. God has condemned them, and they must submit to their punishment. They will all disappear, like the fabrics children build with cards, and which fall one by one under the breath of their builder, even if there are 200 of them. 3 months since, it was Monsieur de Saint-Méran. Madame de Saint-Méran 2 months since. The other day it was Barrois. Today the old Noirtier, or young Valentine. You knew it, cried Morel, in such a paroxysm of terror that Monte Cristo started, he whom the falling heavens would have found unmoved. You knew it, and said nothing. And what is it to me? Replied Monte Cristo, shrugging his shoulders. Do I know those people? And must I lose the one to save the other? Faith, no, for between the culprit and the victim I have no choice. But I, cried Morel, groaning with sorrow, I love her. You love whom? Cried Monte Cristo, starting to his feet and seizing the 2 hands which Morel was raising towards heaven. I love most fondly, I love madly, I love as a man who would give his life-blood to spare her a tear. I love Valentine de Villefort, who is being murdered at this moment. Do you understand me? I love her, and I ask God and you how I can save her. Monte Cristo uttered a cry which those only can conceive who have heard the roar of a wounded lion. Unhappy man, cried he, wringing his hands in his turn. You love Valentine, that daughter of an accursed race. Never had Morel witnessed such an expression, never had so terrible an eye flashed before his face, never had the genius of terror he had so often seen, either on the battlefield or in the murderous nights of Algeria, shaken around him more dreadful fire. He drew back terrified. As for Monte Cristo, after this ebullition, he closed his eyes as if dazzled by internal light. In a moment he restrained himself so powerfully that the tempestuous heaving of his breast subsided, as turbulent and foaming waves yield to the sun's genial influence when the cloud has passed. This silence, self-control, and struggle lasted about 20 seconds. Then the Count raised his pallid face. See, said he, my dear friend, how God punishes the most thoughtless and unfeeling men for their indifference by presenting dreadful scenes to their view. I, who was looking on, an eager and curious spectator, I who was watching the working of this mournful tragedy, I who like a wicked angel was laughing at the evil men committed, protected by secrecy. A secret is easily kept by the rich and powerful. I am in my turn bitten by the serpent whose tortuous course I was watching, and bitten to the heart. Morel groaned. Come, come, continued the Count, complaints are unavailing. Be a man, be strong, be full of hope, for I am here, and will watch over you. Morel shook his head sorrowfully. I tell you to hope. Do you understand me? Cried Monte Cristo. Remember that I never uttered a falsehood, and am never deceived. It is 12 o'clock, Maximilian. Thank heaven that you came at noon rather than in the evening, or tomorrow morning. Listen, Morel, it is noon. If Valentine is not now dead, she will not die. "How so?" cried Morel. "When I left her dying." Monte Cristo pressed his hands to his forehead. What was passing in that brain so loaded with dreadful secrets? What does the angel of light or the angel of darkness say to that mind, at once implacable and generous? God only knows. Monte Cristo raised his head once more, and this time he was calm as a child awaking from its sleep. "Maximilian," said he, "return home. I command you not to stir, attempt nothing, not to let your countenance betray a thought, and I will send you tidings. Go." "Oh, Count, you overwhelm me with that coolness. Have you, then, power against death? Are you superhuman? Are you an angel?" And the young man, who had never shrunk from danger, shrank before Monte Cristo with indescribable terror. But Monte Cristo looked at him with so melancholy and sweet a smile that Maximilian felt the tears filling his eyes. "I can do much for you, my friend," replied the Count. "Go. I must be alone." Morel, subdued by the extraordinary ascendancy Monte Cristo exercised over everything around him, did not endeavour to resist it. He pressed the Count's hand and left. He stopped one moment at the door for Baptistin, whom he saw in the Rue Matignon, and who was running. Meanwhile, Villefort and d'Avrigny had made all possible haste. Valentine had not revived from her fainting fit on their arrival, and the doctor examined the invalid with all the care the circumstances demanded, and with an interest which the knowledge of the secret intensified twofold. Villefort, closely watching his countenance and his lips, awaited the result of the examination. Noirtier, paler than even the young girl, more eager than Villefort for the decision, was watching also intently and affectionately. At last d'Avrigny slowly uttered these words: "She is still alive." "Still?" cried Villefort. "Oh, doctor, what a dreadful word is that!" "Yes," said the physician, "I repeat it, she is still alive, and I am astonished at it." "But is she safe?" asked the father. "Yes, since she lives." At that moment d'Avrigny's glance met Noirtier's eye. It glistened with such extraordinary joy, so rich and full of thought, that the physician was struck. He placed the young girl again on the chair. Her lips were scarcely discernible, they were so pale and white, as well as her whole face, and remained motionless, looking at Noirtier, who appeared to anticipate and commend all he did. "Sir," said d'Avrigny to Villefort, "call Mademoiselle Valentine's maid, if you please." Villefort went himself to find her, and d'Avrigny approached Noirtier. "Have you something to tell me?" asked he. The old man winked his eyes expressively, which we may remember was his only way of expressing his approval. "Privately?" "Yes." "Well, I will remain with you." At this moment Villefort returned, followed by the lady's maid, and after her came Madame de Villefort. "What is the matter, then, with this dear child? She has just left me, and she complained of being indisposed, but I did not think seriously of it." The young woman, with tears in her eyes and every mark of affection of a true mother, approached Valentine and took her hand. D'Avrigny continued to look at Noirtier. He saw the eyes of the old man dilate and become round, his cheeks turn pale and tremble, the perspiration stood in drops upon his forehead. "Ah," said he, involuntarily following Noirtier's eyes, which were fixed on Madame de Villefort, who repeated, "This poor child would be better in bed. Come, Fanny, we will put her to bed." Monsieur d'Avrigny, who saw that would be a means of his remaining alone with Noirtier, expressed his opinion that it would be the best thing that could be done, but he forbade that anything should be given to her except what he ordered. They carried Valentine away. She had revived, but could scarcely move or speak, so shaken was her frame by the attack. She had, however, just power to give one parting look to her grandfather. who, in losing her, seemed to be resigning his very soul. D'avrigny followed the invalid, wrote a prescription, ordered Villefort to take a cabriolet, go in person to a chemist's to get the prescribed medicine, bring it himself, and wait for him in his daughter's room. Then, having renewed his injunction not to give Valentine anything, he went down again to Noirtier, shut the doors carefully, and after convincing himself that no one was listening, "Do you," said he, "know anything of this young lady's illness?" "Yes," said the old man. "We have no time to lose. I will question, and do you answer me." Noirtier made a sign that he was ready to answer. "Did you anticipate the accident which has happened to your granddaughter?" "Yes." D'avrigny reflected a moment, then, approaching Noirtier, "Pardon what I am going to say," added he, "but no indication should be neglected in this terrible situation. Did you see poor Barrois die?" Noirtier raised his eyes to heaven. "Do you know of what he died?" asked d'Avrigny, placing his hand on Noirtier's shoulder. "Yes," replied the old man. "Do you think he died a natural death?" A sort of smile was discernible on the motionless lips of Noirtier. "Then you have thought that Barrois was poisoned?" "Yes." "Do you think the poison he fell a victim to was intended for him?" "No." "Do you think the same hand which unintentionally struck Barrois has now attacked Valentine?" "Yes." "Then she will die too?" asked d'Avrigny, fixing his penetrating gaze on Noirtier. He watched the effect of this question on the old man. "No," replied he, with an air of triumph which would have puzzled the most clever diviner. "Then you hope?" said d'Avrigny with surprise. "Yes." "What do you hope?" The old man made him understand with his eyes that he could not answer. "Ah, yes, it is true," murmured d'Avrigny. Then, turning to Noirtier, "Do you hope the assassin will be tried?" "No." "Then you hope the poison will take no effect on Valentine?" "Yes." "It is no news to you," added d'Avrigny, "to tell you that an attempt has been made to poison her?" The old man made a sign that he entertained no doubt upon the subject. "Then how do you hope Valentine will escape?" Noirtier kept his eyes steadfastly fixed on the same spot. D'avrigny followed the direction, and saw that they were fixed on a bottle containing the mixture which he took every morning. "Ah, indeed," said d'Avrigny, struck with a sudden thought. "Has it occurred to you—" Noirtier did not let him finish. "Yes," said he. "To prepare her system to resist poison?" "Yes." "By accustoming her by degrees—" "Yes, yes, yes," said Noirtier, delighted to be understood. "Of course. I had told you that there was brucine in the mixture I gave you." "Yes." "And by accustoming her to that poison you have endeavoured to neutralize the effect of a similar poison?" Noirtier's joy continued. "And you have succeeded!" exclaimed d'Avrigny. "Without that precaution Valentine would have died before assistance could have been procured. The dose has been excessive, but she has only been shaken by it. And this time, at any rate, Valentine will not die." A superhuman joy expanded the old man's eyes, which were raised towards heaven with an expression of infinite gratitude. At this moment Villefort returned. "Here, doctor," said he, "is what you sent me for." "Was this prepared in your presence?" "Yes," replied the procureur. "Have you not let it go out of your hands?" "No." D'Avrigny took the bottle, poured some drops of the mixture it contained in the hollow of his hand, and swallowed them. "Well," said he, "let us go to Valentine. I will give instructions to everyone, and you, Monsieur de Villefort, will yourself see that no one deviates from them." At the moment when d'Avrigny was returning to Valentine's room, accompanied by Villefort, an Italian priest of serious demeanour and calm and firm tone hired for his use the house adjoining the hotel of M. de Villefort. No one knew how the 3 former tenants of that house left it. About 2 hours afterwards, its foundation was reported to be unsafe, but the report did not prevent the new occupant establishing himself there with his modest furniture the same day at 5 o'clock. The lease was drawn up for 3, 6, or 9 years by the new tenant, who, according to the rule of the proprietor, paid 6 months in advance. This new tenant, who, as we have said, was an Italian, was called Il Signor Giacomo Busoni. Workmen were immediately called in, and that same night the passengers at the end of the faubourg saw with surprise that carpenters and masons were occupied in repairing the lower part of the tottering house. End of chapter 94.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Robin Cotter, Toronto, Ontario, September 2006. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 95. Father and Daughter. We saw in a preceding chapter how Madame Danglars went formally to announce to Madame de Villefort the approaching marriage of Eugénie Danglars and Monsieur Andrea Cavalcanti. This announcement, which implied, or appeared to imply, the approval of all the persons concerned in this momentous affair, had been preceded by a scene to which our readers must be admitted. We beg them to take one step backward, and to transport themselves, the morning of that day of great catastrophes, into the showy, gilded salon we have before shown them, and which was the pride of its owner, Baron Danglars. In this room, at about 10 o'clock in the morning, the banker himself had been walking to and fro for some minutes thoughtfully, and in evident uneasiness, watching both doors and listening to every sound. When his patience was exhausted, he called his valet. "Etienne," said he, "see why Mademoiselle Eugénie has asked me to meet her in the drawing-room, and why she makes me wait so long." Having given this vent to his ill humor, the Baron became more calm. Mademoiselle Danglars had that morning requested an interview with her father, and had fixed on the gilded drawing-room as the spot. The singularity of this step, and above all its formality, had not a little surprised the banker, who had immediately obeyed his daughter by repairing first to the drawing-room. Etienne soon returned from his errand. "Mademoiselle's lady's maid says, sir, that Mademoiselle is finishing her toilette, and will be here shortly." Danglars nodded, to signify that he was satisfied. To the world and to his servants, Danglars assumed the character of the good-natured man and the indulgent father. This was one of his parts in the popular comedy he was performing, a make-up he had adopted and which suited him about as well as the masks worn on the classic stage by paternal actors who, seen from one side, were the image of geniality, and from the other showed lips drawn down in chronic ill-temper. Let us hasten to say that in private the genial side descended to the level of the other, so that generally the indulgent man disappeared to give place to the brutal husband and domineering father. "Why the devil does that foolish girl, who pretends to wish to speak to me, not come into my study? And why on earth does she want to speak to me at all?" He was turning this thought over in his brain for the 20th time, when the door opened and Eugénie appeared, attired in a figured black satin dress, her hair dressed and gloves on, as if she were going to the Italian opera. "Well, Eugenie, what is it you want with me? And why in this solemn drawing-room, when the study is so comfortable?" "I quite understand why you ask, sir," said Eugenie, making a sign that her father might be seated. "And in fact your two questions suggest fully the theme of our conversation. I will answer them both, and contrary to the usual method, the last first, because it is the least difficult. I have chosen the drawing-room, sir, as our place of meeting, in order to avoid the disagreeable impressions and influences of a banker's study. Those gilded cash-books, drawers locked like gates of fortresses, heaps of bank bills come from I know not where, and the quantities of letters from England, Holland, Spain, India, China, and Peru have generally a strange influence on a father's mind, and make him forget that there is in the world an interest greater and more sacred than the good opinion of his correspondents. I have, therefore, chosen this drawing-room, where you see, smiling and happy in their magnificent frames, your portrait, mine, my mother's, and all sorts of rural landscapes and touching pastorals. I rely much on external impressions. Perhaps with regard to you they are immaterial, but I should be no artist if I had not some fancies." "Very well," replied M. Danglars, who had listened to all this preamble with imperturbable coolness, but without understanding a word, since, like every man burdened with thoughts of the past, he was occupied with seeking the thread of his own ideas in those of the speaker. "There is, then, the second point cleared up, or nearly so," said Eugenie, without the least confusion, and with that masculine pointedness which distinguished her gesture and her language. "And you appear satisfied with the explanation. Now, let us return to the first. You ask me why I have requested this interview. I will tell you in 2 words, sir. I will not marry Count Andrea Cavalcanti." Danglars leaped from his chair and raised his eyes and arms towards heaven. "Yes, indeed, sir," continued Eugenie, still quite calm. "You are astonished, I see, for since this little affair began, I have not manifested the slightest opposition, and yet I am always sure, when the opportunity arrives, to oppose a determined and absolute will to people who have not consulted me, and things which displease me. However, this time my tranquillity, or passiveness, as philosophers say, proceeded from another source. It proceeded from a wish, like a submissive and devoted daughter. A slight smile was observable on the purple lips of the young girl, to practice obedience. "Well?" asked Danglars. "Well, sir," replied Eugenie, "I have tried to the very last, and now that the moment has come, I feel in spite of all my efforts that it is impossible." "But," said Danglars, whose weak mind was at first overwhelmed with the weight of this pitiless logic, marking evident premeditation and force of will, "what is your reason for this refusal, Eugenie? What reason do you assign?" "My reason," replied the young girl, "well, it is not that the man is more ugly, more foolish, or more disagreeable than any other. No, Monsieur Andrea Cavalcanti may appear to those who look at men's faces and figures as a very good specimen of his kind. It is not either that my heart is less touched by him than any other. That would be a schoolgirl's reason, which I consider quite beneath me. I actually love no one, sir. You know it, do you not? I do not then see why, without real necessity, I should encumber my life with a perpetual companion. Has not some sage said, 'Nothing too much'? And another, 'I carry all my effects with me'? I have been taught these 2 aphorisms in Latin and in Greek. One is, I believe, from Phaedrus, and the other from Bias. Well, my dear father, in the shipwreck of life, for life is an eternal shipwreck of our hopes, I cast into the sea my useless encumbrance. That is all, and I remain with my own will, disposed to live perfectly alone, and consequently perfectly free. Unhappy girl! Unhappy girl! murmured Danglars, turning pale, for he knew from long experience the solidity of the obstacle he had so suddenly encountered. "Unhappy girl," replied Eugénie. "Unhappy girl, do you say, sir? No, indeed. The exclamation appears quite theatrical and affected. Happy, on the contrary, for what I am in want of. The world called me beautiful. It is something to be well received. I like a favorable reception. It expands the countenance, and those around me do not then appear so ugly. I possess a share of wit and a certain relative sensibility, which enables me to draw from life in general, for the support of mine, all I meet with that is good, like the monkey who cracks the nut to get at its contents. I am rich, for you have one of the first fortunes in France. I am your only daughter, and you are not so exacting as the fathers of the Porte Saint Martin and Gaieté, who disinherit their daughters for not giving them grandchildren. Besides, the provident law has deprived you of the power to disinherit me, at least entirely, as it has also of the power to compel me to marry Monsieur this or Monsieur that. And so, being beautiful, witty, somewhat talented, as the comic operas say, and rich, and that is happiness, sir, why do you call me unhappy?" Danglars, seeing his daughter smiling, and proud even to insolence, could not entirely repress his brutal feelings, but they betrayed themselves only by an exclamation. Under the fixed and inquiring gaze levelled at him from under those beautiful black eyebrows, he prudently turned away, and calmed himself immediately, daunted by the power of a resolute mind. "Truly, my daughter," he replied with a smile, "you are all you boast of being, excepting one thing. I will not too hastily tell you which, but would rather leave you to guess it." Eugénie looked at Danglars, much surprised that one flower of her crown of pride, with which she had so superbly decked herself, should be disputed. "My daughter," continued the banker, "you have perfectly explained to me the sentiments which influence a girl like you, who is determined she will not marry. Now it remains for me to tell you the motives of a father like me, who has decided that his daughter shall marry." Eugénie bowed, not as a submissive daughter, but as an adversary prepared for a discussion. "My daughter," continued Danglars, "when a father asks his daughter to choose a husband, he has always some reason for wishing her to marry. Some are affected with the mania of which you spoke just now, that of living again in their grandchildren. This is not my weakness. I tell you at once, family joys have no charm for me. I may acknowledge this to a daughter whom I know to be philosophical enough to understand my indifference, and not to impute it to me as a crime." "This is not to the purpose," said Eugénie. "Let us speak candidly, sir. I admire candor." "Oh," said Danglars, "I can, when circumstances render it desirable, adopt your system, although it may not be my general practice. I will therefore proceed. I have proposed to you to marry, not for your sake, for indeed I did not think of you in the least at the moment. You admire candor, and will now be satisfied, I hope, but because it suited me to marry you as soon as possible, on account of certain commercial speculations I am desirous of entering into." Eugénie became uneasy. "It is just as I tell you, I assure you, and you must not be angry with me, for you have sought this disclosure. I do not willingly enter into arithmetical explanations with an artist like you, who fears to enter my study lest she should imbibe disagreeable or anti-poetic impressions and sensations. But in that same banker's study, where you very willingly presented yourself yesterday to ask for the 1,000 francs I give you monthly for pocket money, you must know, my dear young lady, that many things may be learned, useful even to a girl who will not marry. There one may learn, for instance, what, out of regard to your nervous susceptibility, I will inform you of in the drawing-room, namely, that the credit of a banker is his physical and moral life, that credit sustains him as breath animates the body. And Monsieur de Monte Cristo once gave me a lecture on that subject, which I have never forgotten. There we may learn that as credit sinks, the body becomes a corpse, and this is what must happen very soon to the banker who is proud to own so good a logician as you for his daughter." But Eugenie, instead of stooping, drew herself up under the blow. "Ruined?" said she. "Exactly, my daughter. That is precisely what I mean," said Danglars, almost digging his nails into his breast, while he preserved on his harsh features the smile of the heartless though clever man. "Ruined. Yes, that is it." "Ah!" said Eugenie. "Yes, ruined. Now it is revealed, this secret so full of horror, as the tragic poet says. Now, my daughter, learn from my lips how you may alleviate this misfortune, so far as it will affect you." "Oh," cried Eugenie, "you are a bad physiognomist if you imagine I deplore on my own account the catastrophe of which you warn me. I ruined? And what will that signify to me? Have I not my talent left? Can I not, like Pasta, Malebranche, Grisi, acquire for myself what you would never have given me? Whatever might have been your fortune, 100 or 150,000 livres per annum, for which I shall be indebted to no one but myself, and which, instead of being given as you gave me those poor 12,000 francs, with sour looks and reproaches for my prodigality, will be accompanied with acclamations, with bravos, and with flowers? And if I do not possess that talent which your smiles prove to me you doubt, should I not still have that ardent love of independence which will be a substitute for wealth, and which in my mind supersedes even the instinct of self-preservation? No, I grieve not on my own account. I shall always find a resource. My books, my pencils, my piano, all the things which cost but little, and which I shall be able to procure, will remain my own. Do you think that I sorrow for Madame Danglars? Undeceive yourself again. Either I am greatly mistaken, or she has provided against the catastrophe which threatens you, and which will pass over without affecting her. She has taken care for herself, at least I hope so, for her attention has not been diverted from her projects by watching over me. She has fostered my independence by professedly indulging my love for liberty. Oh no, sir, from my childhood I have seen too much, and understood too much, of what has passed around me, for misfortune to have an undue power over me. From my earliest recollections I have been beloved by no one, so much the worse, that has naturally led me to love no one, so much the better. Now you have my profession of faith." "Then," said Danglars, pale with anger, which was not at all due to offended paternal love, "then, mademoiselle, you persist in your determination to accelerate my ruin?" "Your ruin? I accelerate your ruin? What do you mean? I do not understand you." "So much the better. I have a ray of hope left. Listen." "I am all attention," said Eugenie, looking so earnestly at her father that it was an effort for the latter to endure her unrelenting gaze. "Monsieur Cavalcanti," continued Danglars, is about to marry you, and will place in my hands his fortune, amounting to 3,000,000 livres." "That is admirable," said Eugenie, with